The night was black and heavy, the kind of Pacific darkness where sky and water vanished into one. On the bridge of the Japanese cruiser Haguro, the glow of plodding lamps painted the faces of officers in pale green. A navigator traced lines across a chart, bearing marks from radio intercepts that made no sense. The signals pulsed steadily from the east, repeating with perfect rhythm. Every station in the fleet could hear them, but none could tell what they were. They weren't Japanese. They weren't weather stations. And they weren't random static. They were too precise, too deliberate. "Captain," the radio officer said quietly, "these signals, they form a grid." The captain frowned, watching the compass needles tremble. "A grid in the open sea?" The officer nodded. "They move with the Americans." Moments later, far beyond the dark horizon, engines stirred the air. Carrier planes, Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats thundered in formation, sweeping through cloud banks invisible to radar, guided by coordinates no human eyes could see. They weren't guessing. They weren't searching. They were navigating, and somewhere, over 1,000 miles away, an operator at a secret Allied station marked the same, grid lines on his own chart. Perfect intersections glowing under. Lamplight. The Americans had built something new. A system that could see through the night and the storm, linking ships and aircraft across an ocean. It was called LORAN, Long-Range Navigation, and it was about to make the Pacific smaller than Japan ever imagined. The Pacific Problem, a war fought in blind distance. The Pacific Ocean was more than a battlefield. It was an abyss, an endless, shifting plain of water so vast that even the most powerful fleets felt small against it. From the Hawaiian Islands to the coast of Japan stretched nearly 4,000 miles, an expanse larger than all of Europe. And in that space, armies vanished. To fight a war across that void was to fight against distance itself. The Japanese Navy had learned to navigate by the stars, by dead reckoning, by the instinct of men who had spent their lives at sea. American fleets did the same. But when the clouds rolled in, when storms covered the moon, when aircraft flew hundreds of miles from their carriers, those instincts failed. The ocean became a labyrinth with no walls, no landmarks, and no mercy. During the early years of the war, even the victors lost their way. American bombers on long-range missions missed targets by dozens of miles. Pilots ditched in the sea because their compasses had drifted. Carriers searched for their own aircraft in darkness. Sometimes they found them. Often they didn't. In 1942, after the Battle of Midway, Admiral Nimitz's staff quietly admitted what no communique could say publicly. "We can fight the Japanese Navy, but we cannot yet fight the Pacific." That realization reached all the way back to the mainland, to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, where some of the brightest scientific minds in America were already working on radar and microwave detection. Among them was a small group of physicists and engineers who believed radio waves could do something more than detect. They could measure. If a radio signal could travel across the sea and be received by two stations at known distances, then a receiver could calculate its position by timing the difference between them, a hyperbolic line of position. It was geometry made real through the speed of light. The challenge was scale, to make it work not over miles, but over oceans. In 1940, this seemed like fantasy. By 1942, the fantasy had a name, LORAN, short for long-range navigation. The concept was simple, but the execution was a miracle of precision. Pairs of radio transmitters placed hundreds of miles apart sent synchronized pulses on low frequencies that traveled vast distances, even over the curve of the Earth. An aircraft or ship equipped with a LORAN receiver could compare the arrival times of those pulses and determine its position with accuracy within a few hundred yards, day or night, in storm or fog, without a single visual landmark. To the Allied commanders, it was as if the ocean itself had been mapped with invisible lines, an unseen grid stretching from Alaska to the Philippines. But secrecy was everything. The Japanese could never know it existed, so while the radar and bombing campaigns made headlines, The true revolution unfolded in silence. In remote stations built on volcanic islands, Arctic tundra, and coral reefs, technicians lived in isolation, manning transmitters that blinked endlessly, sending coded pulses into the darkness. They called themselves the Silent Service, though they wore no uniform. By mid-1943, the first LORAN chain was operational between Atu, Amchitka, and Umnak in the Aleutians, testing grounds where weather was cruel and visibility near zero. When a B-24 navigator used the new system to find a supply base through fog that had grounded every other aircraft, commanders took notice. Soon, more chains followed, stretching down the Central Pacific, across the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. With each new station, the invisible map expanded. By early 1944, a pilot could leave Hawaii, cross the open Pacific, and arrive over a pinpoint island target without ever seeing a star or horizon. U.S. Navy had solved the oldest problem in seafaring: knowing exactly where you were when there was nothing to see. The Japanese still relied on their eyes, their instincts, and their courage. The Americans now relied on mathematics. It was the quietest advantage of the war, and one the enemy wouldn't understand until the end. The secret grid, how the Americans measured the Pacific. The miracle of LORAN wasn't born in a Navy yard or a weapons plant. It was created in the quiet halls of MIT, inside the radiation laboratory, a sprawling maze of chalkboards, wires, and coffee cups. There, mathematicians and physicists, many barely past 30, were designing tools that would let men command not just machines, but time itself. LORAN worked on a principle so simple it bordered on poetry. Radio waves move at the speed of light, but even light takes time to travel. Measure that time precisely enough, and you can measure distance. Each LORAN chain consisted of 2 or more synchronized transmitters, a master and 1 or more secondary stations. The master sent out a pulse of low-frequency radio energy, followed microseconds later by a pulse from the secondary. A receiver on a ship or aircraft recorded the time difference between those signals. That difference placed the vessel somewhere along a curved line, a hyperbola, relative to the 2 transmitters. By comparing signals from 2 such pairs, navigators could pinpoint their exact position on an invisible grid. It was mathematics replacing the stars. The precision was astonishing. In early field tests off Cape Cod, scientists achieved position accuracy within 500 yards at distances of over 700 miles. In later Pacific installations, improvements in pulse timing narrowed that margin to less than 300 yards. For aircraft flying at 200 knots, that meant striking targets within seconds of predicted time, even in complete darkness. But this precision came at a cost: synchronization. Every transmitter had to remain in absolute timing harmony, their pulses aligned to within millionths of a second. To achieve that, engineers designed high-stability oscillators and atomic-calibrated clocks. Operators at remote LORAN sites worked in isolation, tuning transmitters night after night, maintaining the invisible heartbeat of the Pacific War. Those stations were some of the loneliest outposts on Earth. Tiny wooden huts perched on volcanic cliffs or Arctic ice, powered by diesel generators battered by wind and salt. The men who served there were often civilians, physicists and radio engineers in khaki, guarded by small marine detachments. They lived by the rhythm of the pulses, their world measured in microseconds and silence. Their work never made headlines. Even within the Navy, few knew what LORAN truly was. The program was classified top secret, its existence hidden under the innocuous cover of radio weather calibration. The Japanese, listening to the rhythmic bursts on their receivers, cataloged them as mystery beacons, not realizing that those faint ticks were drawing invisible maps across their empire. In 1943, the first operational proof came during a strike from the Aleutians against the Kuril Islands. American bombers, flying through sleet and darkness, reached their targets within 1 mile of predicted coordinates, despite zero visibility. The Japanese radar posts heard the incoming aircraft but couldn't understand how they had navigated with such precision through cloud and storm. To them, the Pacific had always been ruled by instinct and faith, the art of reading wind and current, of trusting the stars. Now the Americans were navigating by numbers, invisible, exact, mercilessly consistent. By the time the island-hopping campaign reached the Marianas, the entire Pacific theater was wrapped in a network of radio beacons. Carriers, submarines, and long-range bombers all carried compact LORAN receivers, gray metal boxes with cathode ray screens that displayed moving hyperbolic curves. Navigators compared those glowing lines, adjusted their dials, and marked their plots in pencil on paper charts. The process took less than a minute. The Japanese saw the results long before they understood the cause. Carrier raids that should have been scattered by weather arrived in tight formation. Night strikes that should have gone astray hit fuel depots dead on. American fleets moved through fog and typhoons as if following rails beneath the sea. Their captains wondered aloud, how can they see us when even their scouts are blind? What they didn't realize was that they weren't being seen at all. They were being calculated, and as the American radio pulses kept ticking across the horizon, the Japanese began to suspect that the enemy's greatest weapon wasn't steel or fire, but time itself, measured to the microsecond. The human dimension, trusting the invisible ocean. For the men who fought across the Pacific, navigation was more than skill, it was faith. Long before LORAN, a navigator's world was measured in guesswork, a bearing taken by compass, a position estimated by dead reckoning, a star sighted between clouds. On calm nights it was art, in storm or darkness it was terror. Every sailor remembered the silence of being lost. The way the sea turned black and featureless, the sky a lid of cloud with no horizon to tell direction from distance. A carrier might launch planes into that void, praying they could find their way back. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes whole squadrons vanished. And then, one night, something changed. Now, inside the radio rooms of destroyers, carriers, and bombers, small screens flickered to life. Lines of light curved gently across the glass, pulsing to a hidden rhythm. The navigator adjusted dials, watching those lines shift until they intersected at a single glowing point. He marked it on his chart, not guessed, not hoped, but known. The sea hadn't changed. The men had, one pilot from Task Force 58, described his first mission using LORAN in early 1944. It was like seeing through the dark. We were flying blind, but the instruments said we weren't. We were exactly where we should be, and for the first time, I believed it. That belief spread like quiet magic through the fleet. Crews who had once measured their courage by how well they faced uncertainty now measured it by how precisely they could read a pulse. Navigation became an act of mathematics, not instinct, not hope. The ocean was no longer unknowable. It had coordinates, lines, intersections, a hidden geometry beneath the waves. But there was something eerie in that confidence. In the night skies above the Pacific, pilots who once scanned the stars now stared at green glowing scopes. The human senses, sight, hearing, touch, meant nothing out there. The plane's wings were buffeted by wind, rain hammered the canopy, and still the navigator's calm voice would come over the intercom. On course, turning 2 degrees port, LORAN confirms. The pilots obeyed, trusting the invisible. They no longer navigated by what they saw, but by what they believed the machine saw. In the ready rooms, men joked that the ocean had grown smaller. They were half right. Distance was no longer measured in fear or uncertainty. It was measured in microseconds, the difference between 2 radio pulses that only the receiver could hear. For the first time in naval history, fleets could move with synchronized precision across hundreds of miles without speaking a word over radio. Invisible to the enemy, linked by timing alone. Every ship in a carrier task force knew exactly where the others were, even beyond the horizon. Every bomber could find its formation through cloud and night. To the men aboard, it felt like order had finally conquered chaos. But to those who understood what it meant, it was something deeper. the moment when human intuition yielded to invisible intelligence. One young Navy radar officer later said, "We stopped looking at the sky for answers. We looked at the scope. In the greatest ocean on Earth, the United States Navy had found a way to replace faith with calculation, and in doing so, it gained a confidence the Japanese could neither see nor comprehend. From that point forward, the Pacific no longer belonged to those who could see farthest. It belonged to those who could measure the unseen." Mathematics as a weapon. How LORAN turned the Pacific into a clockwork battlefield. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was fighting a new kind of war, one not measured in miles or days, but in microseconds. Every radio pulse sent from a LORAN transmitter was a heartbeat in an invisible network that stretched from Alaska to the equator. Each pulse marked the rhythm of American power, unseen, precise, unstoppable. In the old Pacific War, timing had been chaos. Storms scattered convoys. Squadrons missed their rendezvous points. Bombers arrived at targets late or early, ruining coordination. Night strikes were suicidal gambles, pilots navigating by memory and moonlight, their fates decided by cloud cover or luck. A LORAN ended all of that. Now, fleets could move in perfect formation through black water, every ship tracking its position on the same invisible grid. Carrier task forces could launch aircraft by the clock, knowing each plane would reach its target at the same second, even hundreds of miles away. Destroyers screening the formation could maintain exact distance without ever sighting the flagship. Refueling rendezvous at sea, once perilous guesswork, became routine precision. For Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, the difference was transformational. LORAN allowed American forces to execute simultaneous strikes across the Mariana Islands, each one coordinated to the minute, despite weather that had grounded Japanese planes. The system's reach meant that air groups could launch before dawn, hit their objectives through overcast skies, and return to moving carriers without visual cues, guided entirely by the geometry of radio. Japanese naval observers, listening to intercepted communications, began to notice an unsettling pattern. The Americans struck not only with overwhelming force, but with impossible timing. Different attack groups separated by hundreds of miles arrived within moments of each other. Even in storm conditions, they struck from angles that suggested perfect positional awareness. To Tokyo's naval staff, it defied logic. They suspected new radar types, perhaps secret aircraft with magnetic homing. But no intelligence report could explain why American formations never got lost. The answer was chillingly simple. They couldn't. LORAN had made uncertainty obsolete. It had turned the entire Pacific theater into a synchronized system, one in which every movement, every flight path, every bombardment schedule could be calculated to sub-second accuracy. The Navy no longer needed to guess at weather or visibility. It could plan with machine precision, and with that precision came a new kind of warfare, one that blurred the line between tactics and physics. Commanders no longer fought by intuition or eyesight. They fought by timing diagrams, waveforms, and mathematical certainty. In the control rooms of Task Force 58, officers watched clocks instead of horizons. In aircraft-ready rooms, navigators briefed using lines of hyperbolic curves, not compass bearings. And on the bridges of Japanese destroyers, captains peered through binoculars into the empty dark, unaware that their enemy already knew exactly where they were and exactly when to strike. The transformation was so complete that one admiral called it the death of chance at sea. For centuries, navies had lived by the elements, stars, tides, and wind. Now, the ocean itself had been conquered by mathematics. In the words of one LORAN engineer years later, "We didn't just teach the Navy where it was, we taught it when it was." And that was everything. By mid-1944, the Pacific War was no longer a contest of navigation. It was a test of who could read the invisible, and only one side could: the Great Marianas Operation, when the night belonged to the machines. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The sky was a void of black cloud and starlight. Beneath it, the greatest concentration of naval power in human history steamed west. Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet, Task Force 58. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and oilers, a living city on the water. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, waited the Japanese Mobile Fleet, the last major carrier force the Empire could muster. The stage was set for a battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific, but the Americans held an invisible weapon. Each ship's chart room glowed with the same faint, light, green cathode ray, screens drawing lines that curved across transparent overlays. Navigators worked in silence, comparing hyperbolic plots, their pencils marking exact intersections. No stars, no landmarks, only the heartbeat of LORAN pulses echoing across the sea. Every few seconds, each receiver clicked, a perfect rhythm. Each click represented a radio wave that had traveled hundreds of miles from a station perched on a distant island. Together, they drew a map more accurate than any compass. At 0200 hours, when the order came to launch the first night strike, USS Lexington turned into the wind. Her deck crews worked under red lights. Engines whined. Propellers blurred into silver arcs. One after another, TBF Avengers and F-6F Hellcats rolled forward, vanished into the night, and disappeared into nothingness. There were no stars to guide them. No moon, the sea below was invisible. But the men at their instruments weren't afraid. They had their coordinates, calculated through the pulses ticking in their headsets. The grid existed whether they could see it or not. As they flew west toward the Marianas, the enemy was preparing too. Japanese lookouts strained their eyes across the dark water, scanning for silhouettes. On their radar scopes, static crawled, interference, reflections, noise, but no solid targets. To them, the night was empty. At dawn, that illusion shattered. Hellcats swept out of the rising sun, diving through broken cloud. Torpedo bombers followed, emerging from layers of mist in perfect formation, each aircraft arriving from a different bearing, synchronized within seconds. They struck airfields on Guam, Rota, and Saipan, cutting through anti-aircraft fire with mechanical precision. Japanese commanders were stunned. They had expected scattered raids, weather delays, confusion. Instead, the Americans appeared in flawless waves, as if directed by a single, unseen hand. Every attack arrived on time. Every retreat turned on a shared clock that no one could jam or intercept. In the operations room aboard the carrier Zuikaku, officers studied their own radio intercepts. Dozens of strange pulses, steady, rhythmic, each lasting microseconds, filled their headphones. To them, it sounded like background static, but the signals were too regular. They seemed to map themselves. A staff officer pointed at the intercept chart and muttered, "These transmissions, they form coordinates." No one believed him. Not yet. But across the ocean, in the same instant, American strike leaders were adjusting headings using those exact signals. When the first formations turned home, they did so by LORAN plot, arriving precisely over the fleet's position, though the sea below was a uniform blue void. As the sun fell again, the U.S. Navy prepared for its second wave. The Japanese expected nightfall to bring safety. Darkness had always been the ally of retreat. But that night, darkness betrayed them. The carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, and Yorktown, launched new groups guided entirely by LORAN. Their targets were moving. Japanese carriers fleeing north. Using pulse difference coordinates transmitted through the night air, American navigators plotted intercept points hundreds of miles away. Their timing was perfect. The night sky lit with tracer fire and burning fuel. LORAN had done the impossible, made the Pacific navigable at night, at speed, and under combat. The ocean that had once hidden enemies now hid nothing. At 2200 hours, a single Japanese officer aboard Chitose looked at his plotting table, covered in radio intercept lines that converged on nothing. "They know where we are," he whispered, "but we do not know where they are." The difference between those two truths decided the battle. By morning, over 300 Japanese aircraft were gone. Their carriers were crippled or burning. American losses were minimal. The Japanese pilots had flown by courage. The Americans had flown by numbers. And as dawn broke over the Marianas, the last illusion of Japanese control over the Pacific vanished, erased not by bombs, but by the ticking pulse of radio waves crossing an ocean. When the enemy understood too late, Japan's awakening to LORAN. By the summer of 1944, reports were piling up in Tokyo. Signals intercept logs, radar plots, navigational anomalies. Japanese signal officers had been recording a strange pattern for months. Rhythmic bursts of radio energy, low frequency, repeating with mathematical precision. They appeared everywhere, from the Aleutians to the Marianas, from the Philippine Sea to the Central Pacific. At first, analysts dismissed them as weather transmissions, perhaps American test beacons. But the evidence became impossible to ignore. Every time those pulses appeared, the U.S. Navy followed, carrier groups moving as if on rails, aircraft finding their targets through fog and night. Inside the Imperial Navy's Communications Research Bureau, technicians compared the pulse intervals. The timing was exact, down to the microsecond. One senior engineer finally said what no one wanted to admit. These signals, they are not communication. They are measurement. He drew it on the board, 2 points representing transmitters, arcs of radio waves spreading across a map of the Pacific. Where the waves overlapped, they formed intersecting curves. A pattern so familiar it stunned the room. It was navigation, not by stars, not by compass, but by time itself. The discovery landed like a thunderclap. The Americans weren't just using radar to find ships. They were using radio to find themselves. For the Japanese, this revelation came too late to matter. Their own engineers had experimented with short-range radio navigation before the war, but never at this scale. Japan's electronics industry, though brilliant in craftsmanship, lacked the mass production and synchronization tools needed to replicate what MIT's radiation lab had achieved. They could not match the precision of LORAN's timing circuits, nor deploy the vast network of stations the Allies now controlled across the Pacific. Still, they tried. Orders went out to build countermeasures. Jammers, pulse scramblers, interference transmitters. Engineers at Yokosuka designed a system they called Kiko, an attempt to mask returning signals by flooding the airwaves with static. But it was futile. LORAN's low frequencies traveled too far, and its pulse sequences were too unique to imitate. The Americans simply changed patterns, recalibrated timing, and kept moving. The Japanese Navy Intelligence Service sent urgent memos to frontline commanders. Enemy fleets appear to be using coordinated radio pulses for navigation. Cause unknown. Maintain radio silence. Increase visual patrols. But by then, visibility no longer mattered. The Americans no longer needed the sun or the horizon. They could navigate without seeing and strike without warning. When fragments of American equipment began washing ashore on captured islands, the truth became undeniable. Technicians recovered a gray metal box, roughly the size of a lunch pail, with a small cathode ray screen and timing dials labeled delay and pulse. The Japanese engineers who examined it realized they were looking at a map of the invisible. One naval scientist reportedly whispered, "They have made the ocean their laboratory." By late 1944, the Japanese command's tone had shifted from analysis to despair. A secret report to Admiral Toyota read, "The enemy appears capable of navigating entire fleets through darkness and weather with uncanny accuracy. The principle is unknown, but it renders traditional tactics obsolete." In that single sentence lay the end of an empire built on seamanship and intuition. The Pacific. Once Japan's natural defense had become the Americans' most precise weapon. LORAN had turned what was infinite into something measurable. The Americans moved as if guided by fate. The Japanese moved as if trapped by it. As the war closed in around them, from the Philippines to Okinawa, the Japanese Navy no longer fought a visible enemy. It fought against a grid that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. One captured officer, interrogated after the war, described the feeling aboard ship. "At night, we felt the sea turn against us. We could not see them, but they always knew where we were. It was as if the Americans had conquered time itself." And, in a sense, they had. The Japanese admirals who finally examined Allied documents after surrender were stunned. Charts of the Pacific overlaid with LORAN hyperbolas revealed the truth. The Americans had been fighting within a mathematical ocean, an invisible geometry that had mapped every wave and horizon. Every ship, every squadron, every strike had been part of that pattern. The Pacific War had always been a contest of distance. Now, distance itself had lost. The grid that never slept. How LORAN redrew the map of war. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the U.S. Navy began counting not just its ships and aircraft, but its signals. Those steady, synchronized pulses that had guided fleets across the largest ocean on Earth. And in that count lay one of the quietest revolutions in military history. The numbers told their own story. By VJ Day, over 70 LORAN stations were operating from Alaska to Okinawa, from the Aleutians to the Philippines. The system covered an area of more than 100 million square miles, linking every major Allied base in the Pacific with invisible corridors of timing. The same signals that had guided carrier strikes to the Marianas now guided troop convoys, supply ships, and medical evacuations home. For the Navy's planners, LORAN was more than a tool. It was proof of concept, that the future of command would belong to those who owned the clock, not just the compass. Admiral Chester Nimitz, himself a former submariner obsessed with precision, ordered a complete review of naval navigation doctrine. The report that followed read almost like prophecy. The Pacific War has demonstrated that radio navigation has become the backbone of coordinated sea power. Victory depended upon synchronization, not chance sighting. Within months, LORAN stations that had once pulsed for war were recalibrated for peace. Merchant ships, survey vessels, and aircraft began using the same signals for safe passage. Fishing fleets in the North Atlantic, airliners over the Arctic, even polar expeditions adopted the American system. What had begun as a secret wartime network became a new global utility, the first worldwide navigation grid. Meanwhile, engineers from the radiation laboratory published declassified manuals describing how LORAN worked. One Navy scientist wrote in a post-war journal, "For 4 years, men trusted coordinates they could not see. Now the world will learn to trust the same." Yet beneath that optimism lay something more profound. LORAN had proven that control of time was control of movement, that whoever could synchronize the flow of seconds could synchronize the flow of armies. The same principle would later define Cold War strategy, ballistic missile guidance, and eventually the digital clocks orbiting Earth in satellites called GPS. The chain from LORAN to GPS was unbroken, pulse to pulse, signal to signal. Both systems measured delay, distance, and difference. Both turned invisible waves into maps. Both transformed geography into geometry. To the men who had built it, that connection was personal. They had watched navigators plot their first accurate positions in a storm-tossed sea and realized they had created more than a weapon. They had created a new relationship between humanity and the planet itself. The sea was no longer infinite, the air no longer unknowable, the night no longer blind. Japanese officers who toured captured LORAN sites after surrender were silent. One, a veteran navigator from the Yamato, stood before the tall, humming transmitter tower on Saipan and murmured, "So this is what we fought against. We could never have won against this." He wasn't speaking of the machinery itself, but of what it represented, a civilization that had learned to make mathematics visible, to command the very dimension of time. The Americans had not just crossed the Pacific. They had measured it, and in doing so, they had changed the meaning of navigation, strategy, and victory itself. From pulses to orbits, the long shadow of LORAN. In the years after World War II, the towers stayed up. Their pulses continued, steady, precise, and tireless, long after the ships they once guided were scrapped or mothballed. The Pacific had gone quiet, but LORAN never stopped ticking. It was supposed to be temporary, a wartime experiment obsolete by peace. Instead, it became the invisible backbone of the modern world. When the Cold War began, those same radio chains became a strategic web. LORAN stations now marked not just routes for ships and aircraft, but the edges of empire. From Greenland to Guam, from Iceland to Okinawa, a new network, LORAN C, rose on the foundations of its wartime ancestor. Its transmitters no longer guided bombers to islands. They guided reconnaissance planes to Soviet airspace, submarines through Arctic channels, and nuclear-armed fleets across the Polar Sea. Navigation had become national defense. To lose timing was to lose control. By the 1950s, American engineers were experimenting with something even more extraordinary: satellite-based timekeeping. They realized that LORAN's principle, measuring distance by the delay between synchronized signals, could be extended into space. Instead of transmitters on islands, the new system would use transmitters in orbit. The geometry was the same, only the scale had changed. That idea became transit, the Navy's first satellite navigation system in 1960. And, decades later, GPS. Every smartphone, every missile, every commercial jet flying above the clouds still calculates its position the same way a B-24 navigator once did, by comparing signal delays from synchronized transmitters. The equations are identical. The ocean has simply moved into the sky. LORAN's legacy also transformed espionage and intelligence. Early warning networks, radar picket lines, and missile tracking systems all borrowed its heartbeat synchronization. Even the atomic clocks used to coordinate nuclear launch sequences were descendants of those wartime oscillators humming in wooden huts across the Pacific. It was a chain of evolution that began with a handful of pulses over the ocean and ended with a planet that could measure itself to within inches. But for the men who built the first LORAN stations, the memory of that creation was not pride alone. It was awe and a little fear. They had seen how precision could conquer uncertainty, how invisible numbers could decide the fate of nations. And they understood that humanity had crossed an invisible line, where once the world had been guided by nature, by stars, tides, and instinct, it was now guided by man's own rhythm, measured and synchronized into obedience. Time itself had become a weapon, and whoever mastered it would master everything that moved. In the words of Commander J.H. Atkinson, one of LORAN's original architects, "We built a clock so accurate it could find a ship in a storm. But in truth, what we built was something larger, a way to make the Earth itself keep time for us." By the dawn of the atomic age, the war was over. But the pulses continued, steady, invisible, eternal. They were the echoes of a discovery that had changed the nature of warfare forever, that control of time is the final form of power. The war that time remembered. In history books, the Pacific War is remembered for the thunder, the bombers over Tokyo, the battleships at Leyte, the mushroom cloud rising over Nagasaki. But beneath that noise was a rhythm, faint, steady, mathematical, a pulse that never stopped. That rhythm was LORAN. It didn't roar or flash or burn. It simply measured. And in that act of measurement, it changed everything. For centuries, seamen had trusted their eyes and instincts to cross the ocean. Then, in a single generation, men learned to trust numbers, invisible coordinates, the difference between two radio pulses crossing an empty sky. They learned that distance could be conquered not by strength, but by precision. The Japanese captains who stared at those mysterious radio plots in 1944 had glimpsed the future. They saw a world where victory would no longer belong to the boldest, but to the most synchronized, to those who could make the universe itself keep time with their heartbeat. LORAN was not a weapon in the usual sense. It didn't sink ships or shoot down planes, but it turned the world into a clock, and whoever could read that clock ruled the horizon. From that quiet grid of the pulses came the logic that still shapes every warship, every missile, every satellite today. The idea that control begins not with what you see, but with what you can measure. In the Pacific, the Americans didn't just find their way across the water. They found their way into a new age, an age where time was territory, and knowledge itself was navigation. And though the last LORAN towers have long since gone silent, their echoes still live in every device that tells us where we are, reminding us that the victory of 1944 was not just over Japan, but over blindness itself, because on those dark nights, when no stars were visible and no horizon could be seen, the Americans followed an invisible light, and the ocean, for the first time in history, answered.